Thank you everybody for joining the conversation today. Davion, thank you for setting aside the time. Just to begin with a little bit of context, about 10 years ago, I had started a speaker series in New York. The idea was to help young professionals, college students think through how they were going to navigate their career. I'd host these events at Morgan Stanley, and Davion would oftentimes be a speaker at these events, would bring in his friends to also be a speaker.
I think it's kind of amazing that it's been 10 years ago since you created this, Triston. And for everyone out there, Tristan's aging me. He's a few years my senior, for anyone who doesn't know. But we did start working at Morgan Stanley. Again, my name is Davion Lewis. I'm originally from Newark, New Jersey. And I went to Villanova University for college, where I majored in finance and accounting. And then, of course, after that, went to Morgan Stanley, where I had a few different jobs, first in sales and trading and then investment banking. And now I'm currently an associate at TPG Capital, which is a private equity company that manages about, I would say, 90 billion AUM. And so to the extent that we can both be helpful to everyone on this call to kind of answer any questions, mainly pertaining to kind of like this idea of thriving early in your career, but generally speaking about anything on your mind, we'd be happy to take questions and share our insight.
We'll start just with some opening thoughts on the subject of really how to thrive early on in your career. Then we'll address some of the questions which submitted when you RSVP'd, and we'll leave time at the end for open Q&A. And we'll close out with just some resources and ways to stay in touch and follow up with both Davion and myself. Just a few conversation reminders. Please remain on mute unless speaking. And when you please do actively ask questions. The point of this event is really to address what's on your mind. So click the raise hand button on Zoom. And if you're open to turning the video on, I think that always makes for a nicer experience, especially when posing questions. So please do feel free to do that as well. When we're talking about table stakes, we're really referring to the skills and attributes that are kind of the prerequisites for gaining a seat at the table. Those things include having a polished resume, a strong work ethic, critical thinking, high IQ and high EQ. And for the jobs that many people on this call end up going into, I think this is very much the baseline in terms of what is expected. And doing so, especially I know there's a mixture of people on the call, some who are in college and some who have recently graduated college, to a handful that are a bit further out. I think these table stakes, mastering them can oftentimes get you a seat at the table. But the purpose of our conversation today is to go beyond that. It's not just about getting a seat at the table, but what does it really take to excel? And from what we've seen, these table stakes alone are not going to be sufficient in terms of reaching the desired outcomes, especially for those people that are, extremely ambitious, as is the case. I think people, whether you're dialing in on your weekend in the US or you're dialing in at 7 a.m. In Singapore and parts of Asia, either way, you're carving out your personal time for this topic. And I think that the reality is the people who are really ambitious, these table stakes are not going to be enough. And so that's what our conversation today is really about. I think to lay the foundation, we'll touch on three things: developing your self-confidence, being your authentic self, and building your support team. And maybe to do each of these, I feel like I'll share some of my own stories. Davion will share some of his own stories as well. But for myself, I'll begin with an example around self-confidence, because I really do think that it does lay the foundation for you having the courage and the willingness to make some big moves that are going to be really helpful, especially early on in your career as you're trying to demonstrate the way that you make an impact. And so I'd say one of the things and examples is how over the years I've tried to go about developing my communication skills, which has helped me increase my confidence. So in my freshman year at Penn, I had to take a writing seminar. All freshmen have to take a writing seminar. And I remember I got I'm calling it a failure. I got like a B in the course, and coming off of high school, I was used to getting mainly A's, and so a B felt like a failure. But bear with me for the purpose of the story. I went into this, but really it was, as my professor had mentioned, it was almost like getting you might have heard of a gentleman's C, but I think in this case I got a gentleman's B, in that I didn't actually, he pulled me aside at the end of the semester and said, Triston, I'm giving you a B because I think you've worked harder than any other student in this class. I can tell you're really trying, but your writing just needs a lot of work. If you want to succeed at Penn, uh, do something to really try and focus on improving your writing sooner rather than later. So after that, I opted into taking another writing seminar, which was completely optional. Most of my friends at the time thought I was crazy for signing up for one of these. These were not the most popular courses at Penn when I was in college. But I really wanted to take the professor's advice and try and improve on this area where I was weak. So I ended up getting an A in the course. But beyond getting an A in the course, I think the thing that really mattered here was that I took every single paper that I wrote to the writing center, and then just constantly got feedback and was able to improve on that, build on that. And actually, the director of the writing center, who's pictured on the bottom, she had mentioned to me at the end of the semester that I had used the writing center more than any student that she had known in her 10 years at Penn. And she asked me if I wanted to become a writing tutor. So I went from one professor telling me that, like the semester before, that I really needed to improve my writing, to the director of the writing center asking me if I wanted to coach my peers on writing in the course of a semester. And the thing that got it there was really taking every single paper that I wrote multiple times to the writing center. So there's a lot of like progress and work that came in there. But this, process really was something that started to drive my confidence and see, okay, you can actually take something that's a weakness, and if you continually focusing on it, you can kind of turn it into a strength. Um, so I realized after I went through this experience of trying to develop my writing, that I wanted to focus on developing my public speaking. I felt as though I was very uncomfortable initially, kind of sharing stories about myself, standing in front of people, telling my story. Um, Using a similar approach, I ended up actually becoming a public speaking coach at Penn. And once I became a public speaking coach, I actually became the first student that was both a writing tutor and a public speaking coach at that point. And this was, just continuing to build momentum. And I think that after you fail a few times, your success rate when you're trying new things will start to go up. And it's in part because you're deploying. So when I say deploy skill A, every time you fail and then you succeed the next time around, you're learning something that you can then apply. And it's at the foundation the next time you go, the next time you take an attempt. So I think your success rate will go up with time. And maybe the last story on this point that I'll share is in my sophomore year of college, there's an organization called the Executive Leadership Council that's for African American CEOs or people who are reporting into the CEO or people who are running a $1 billion plus business unit. They have an essay competition, and I participated in this essay competition my sophomore year of college. And I ended up winning this national essay competition, or the 10 winners, and they flew us all to New York. Carla Harris, who we'll talk more about a bit later, she was the chairman of this organization. This was the first time that I met her, and she ended up having a tremendous impact on my life. But I share this because it's a full kind of moment, a full circle moment where I struggled as at writing in my first semester. In my second semester, I put in a lot of work. In my third semester, I became a writing tutor. In my fourth semester, I participated and won this like essay competition. So I think that college, one of the beautiful things about college is you can really have these very defined periods of time where you can see a lot of the growth happening in rapid succession. For a lot of the people on this call who are not still currently in college, I think the trick is you need to be able to see the wins, and you need to be able to kind of maintain the motivation when it might be a little bit more spread out and distant than it was in college. But how do you still maintain that feeling of confidence, progress, and so forth that we maybe see a little bit more easily when in college? Um, on this point of, uh, I think that at the core of what builds this confidence, from my perspective, is failure. And just a few quotes that really deeply resonate with me. The first being, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take, of course, from Michael Jordan and or Wayne Gretzky. The quote gets attributed to both at different times. But we'll go with Michael Jordan here. And then this other quote from Michael Jordan definitely really resonates with me in terms of calculating the number of shots that he's missed and the number of times that he's been trusted to take the game-winning shot and he's missed it. Now, of course, when we think about, Michael Jordan, we think of all of the clutch shots that he did make, and it's part of what makes him such an incredible player. But really, this idea of taking shots, making an attempt. And if we think about who is the NBA player that has missed more shots than anybody else in history, it's Kobe Bryant, who's undeniably one of the best players to ever kind of play the game. And actually, if you look at the list of all of the people that have set records for kind of the most number of shots taken, they're all the best players in the game. Now, of course, yes, that they're taking more shots because they're given the ball more because they are as great as they are, but the way that they got there. And I think that Kobe Bryant's mentality. He was asked in an interview once how he felt about setting the record, and he's like, "Look, I'm a shooting guard that's been in the game for 19 years. Um, like if these top players are having a cold streak, they don't stop shooting. They continue attempting." And I think that analogy can really be translated very much into a business sense. Um, this quote of if you don't succeed at first try again. This is definitely something that resonates with me. The first time that I applied to Morgan Stanley as a sophomore in college, I was rejected. I came back as a junior in college and reapplied and was able to gain a spot. The first time I applied to BCG was in college. I was rejected, and then I came back, applied to BCG during business school, and now I'm working at BCG now. And again, with this notion of like your success rate will increase with time. I applied the first time I applied to HBS. I actually ended up getting in the first time around, but sometimes when I applied to business school, I decided that HBS was going to be the only school that I applied to. And sometimes when I talk to peers, that surprises them because a lot of people will oftentimes apply to 4 or 5 different schools. But my mentality was I knew that I wanted to go to HBS. And I had seen a few times before, look, I might not get in this time. But if I didn't get into HBS, I was going to apply again, and I was going to continue to take my shot. So I think that this point of really the misses that you have in life, they're character building, and they can really propel you to excel. Um, the next piece around kind of being your authentic self. So we've talked about Carla Harris, or I touched on her very briefly because she's the chairman of the Executive Leadership Council. She's somebody that both Davion and I know. She's a vice chairman at Morgan Stanley. Um, Absolutely incredible. She's been there over 30 years at this point. In addition to being a banker, she's also a gospel singer. She's had 5 sold-out concerts at Carnegie Hall. She has performed at Madison Square Garden. She's was chair of one of President Obama's national councils, on the board of Walmart, on the board of Harvard. Really exceptional person. And a lot of what she speaks about is her authenticity. And the example that she'll use is she's always been somebody who is a singer, and she used to try and conceal that side of herself early on in her investment banking careers because she thought that it would be something that would get in the way or make people think of her less seriously. But then she ended up embracing this eventually, and it became at the core. She would walk into a pitch where she was trying to win a deal, and she would begin by singing a jingle to the executive team. Or say actually using her singing as a platform for her to excel in a business perspective. So this quote around your authenticity being at the heart of your distinct advantage is one of the many messages, and there's a lot of YouTube videos on Carla Harris. So for people who are want to think about how do you become excellent and what are some of the things you can do earlier on in your career to set yourself up for success, I would just go to YouTube and look at some videos of Carla Harris. You'll find a lot of fantastic content there. I think for me, staying true to who I am, it means understanding and leveraging my unique strengths. So yes, early on in your career, it's important to develop your area, your weaknesses, so that they don't become obstacles in your career. But at the end of the day, the thing that makes people successful is their strengths, and then finding opportunities and roles and seats that are connected to their strengths, and allow them to basically set themselves up for success. Reflect often and listen to yourself. So I think oftentimes we know what's right for us, but when we start listening to other people, it can start to, we can let society and other people's perspectives guide our own life as opposed to our opinions. So that brings to the final point, and just like really having confidence to chart your own path. And then once you have that path, actually stay on that path, as opposed to, switching off that path because somebody else, because people around you are doing something different from what you are doing. The people that reach the highest levels of success have for sure they have their vision and they stay true to that vision. And then the last piece, I really think that nobody kind of achieves success in their career early on at any point without a huge support network. So really think about like, who are the people around you, and surround yourself with people that inspire, support, enable you to reach your full potential. I think that will make a tremendous difference in terms of reaching and achieving your career success. So I just wanted to kind of share my story in terms of what I feel like really makes a difference with these building blocks, beginning with self-confidence and self-improvement, then really thinking about your authentic self, what your strengths are and so forth, and your support team. I think with those things in place, in my mind, you're setting yourself up pretty nicely for success early on in your career. I will pause there. Davion, I'll turn it over to you just to kind of share your perspective on the topic, your own thoughts, any reactions or things that you think will be helpful to the audience, and then we'll open it up for questions after that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think first it's important to kind of touch base again as to kind of why this is the topic that we're talking about today. And I think Triston alluded to it earlier, which is essentially there's so many talented people in the world, right? There's so many talented individuals in school as well as on the professional level. And when you get to a point where you notice that your lofty goals really come at a sacrifice in a lot of ways, right? And so obviously you have to be smart. Obviously you have to be kind of multifaceted in a lot of ways. But in order to kind of level up, if you will, it's going to require times where you have to kind of take a step back and really think about how you can be a differentiator in the world that you exist in, right? And so I think the ideas and concepts of first building confidence is one that I personally struggle with out of undergrad. And I think the important part about that is confidence in general, I don't think is anything that I have a problem with, right? I think you ask my parents or my friends who know me closest, and they'll say that Davion's a very confident person. However, when I first started off working at Morgan Stanley within such a larger institution, it was clear to me that my confidence was actually a piece of my previous strengths that had been hindered, right? And so thinking about my own personal story with that, I figured that a lot of younger professionals probably exist in a world where generally they feel pretty confident, or generally they feel really good about their abilities. But for some reason, maybe between listening to what you're supposed to be doing or listening to kind of the self-doubt that you have in your mind, there seems to be kind of disjointedness once we actually step foot in the professional workspace. And so that's part of the reason why I think this conversation is relevant. In addition to the fact that once you develop the confidence, knowing where to go after that in terms of bringing your full self to work is extremely important. And I'll say from my own experience, when I first started off as a sales and trading analyst at Morgan Stanley, there were a lot of thoughts obviously going through my mind, waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning and having to kind of be responsible for my own ability to generate revenue for the firm. And what I noticed was I was spending a lot of mental calories on how to behave, how I should act, what I should say to certain people. And there was just such a hyper focus on the things that I was doing that it didn't allow myself to actually be free to be a creative and impactful individual at that current level. And so I had a few talks with mentors, and essentially their advice was, at some point you really have to stop thinking about how other people are viewing you, right? It's one thing if your boss is coming up to you and saying, hey, we think you could do better in this regard, but it's a total other thing when you're allowing your own kind of, you're allowing yourself to be your own worst enemy, right? And you're not kind of bringing your full self to the room. And so with that mentality and those kind of constructs, what I set out to do was essentially to reach out to my peers and my coworkers in a different way that kind of spoke to who I was. And a quick example actually was in investment banking. there's a few VPs who I didn't feel as though I had the best relationships with. And those relationships were directly impactful on kind of my performance reviews as well as the bonuses that I received. And so what I thought to myself was one of the reasons why I feel so uncomfortable kind of approaching these people is because I didn't feel as though they got a good view as to who I was as a person. And so one of the things that I did, and I recommend that you all do, is if you can, allow those people in your organization that you would like a better rapport with to kind of get a viewpoint into your world. And so my example actually takes place at one of the forums that Triston and I did at Morgan Stanley, where I invited those two VPs who I didn't necessarily felt knew me at a deeper level to one of the talks that I hosted. And I did that because I felt particularly strong in public speaking. And I thought that if they were to see me kind of in a frame where I felt more confidence, right, there would be an ability to kind of penetrate our relationship a bit further. And what I was met with was, after this particular workshop with Triston, the very next week, both of the people who I invited from my team were inviting me out for coffee. And we got to speak about a lot of the things that were kind of personally impactful to me, right? Diversity building, professional development workshops, right? This affinity that I had towards the inner city. And so that actually allowed a lot of doors to open once, those conversations were had. And so again, I think on the topic of when you feel the confidence in your strengths and abilities, you should never be shy to make those known to other people around you, because they'll start to gravitate towards that confidence that you kind of exude. And then on the last point of how to, navigate again effectively, what you'll notice is whenever we think about networks, everyone, I think more oftentimes than not, people who are more senior to you come to mind, right? You're thinking about mentors, you're thinking about champions at your job, you're thinking about sponsors. But what's also equally, if not more important, are the peer relationships that you create. And so what I think those do in terms of creating an advantage for you, kind of again beneath these table stakes, is one, when you tap into your peer network, you're able to have further connections, right? There's multiple times when the people that I knew were in higher positions at work, I didn't have a direct line to the CFO, or I didn't have a direct line to the vice chairman of a firm. However, there were peers that were in my inner circle that actually had really great relationships to these people, right? And so being able to leverage that peer network ultimately allowed me to leverage kind of the more senior people within, the stratosphere that I wanted to be in. And so that's the first thing that I think peer networks do. The second really comes out of this thought process that you get a lot of what I would say on the ground training from your peers, right? And so inevitably, when you are a young professional, many of you on the phone are, there's probably times where you think, I have a question, or I want to learn how to do this particular skill set or model or analysis. However, I don't want to seem kind of ignorant or not capable to the person that I'm reporting into. And so the very best thing that I think has helped me in those scenarios is actually being able to tap into my peers who are also kind of, more junior in their career or at the associate or analyst level. And they will actually give you the information that you need on the grounds. And I think for a lot of people, asking the peer network is a bit of a struggle because we have this idea of it being more of a competition. But what I can tell you from my own experience is that the putting your pride aside and setting your pride aside for those brief moments when you are reaching out for help is a very small cost to pay to when you turn in analysis to your higher ups that is pretty flawless because you've already done the self-correction and tapped into your network to allow you to deliver a really great project. And so those are just my high level thoughts about, how I think we as, ambitious young people need to approach our daily lives within the workspace.
Awesome. Thank you, Davion. And I love the example in terms of inviting your VPs to the actual session amongst a bunch of the other things that you touched on. I think it demonstrates, an incredible level of intentionality and thought in terms of navigating that. And really, we talked about turning weaknesses into strengths, but I also think that you can turn relationships that feel lukewarm into some of your, biggest support system. And I think that that's an example of it. And it's also an example of giving back and kind of, helping yourself while also helping other people in the context of these events. So for a whole bunch of reasons, I really, that resonates a lot with me. Let's go ahead and open it up to Q&A. We'll begin with some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. maybe we'll begin. Carisha, I see that you've turned on your video, so maybe we'll go ahead and we'll begin with you.
Thank you. And thank you both for hosting this event. I think some of your responses in terms of having a supportive network internally, and then to the last point about digging into your junior cohort kind of addresses the question in some regard, but I'd love to dig a little deeper. I think you guys both worked at Morgan Stanley, so these are organizations, particularly, I guess, after the year that we just had, where a lot of organizations are acknowledging some of the hardships, particularly with their more diverse talent. How do you guys kind of think about, particularly in this work from home environment, overcoming some of the obstacles when organizations aren't fully, I guess, reflecting the initiatives and the goals and the programs that they're saying that they're doing in terms of training, developing, mentoring, retaining diverse talent, when you don't see that actually happening in the day-to-day today?
Yeah, no, so it's a good question. And for me, I always think about, if something isn't effective, that's an opportunity. And there's somebody senior at your organization who is tasked with actually doing that well. And he or she probably knows that it is not going well. And it's not for lack of them wanting to go well. It's for reality of some of these problems are very, very challenging to solve. So what I've done in many cases is I've thought to myself, okay, well, how can I actually go about helping them? So if we're talking about the topic of diversity, definitely an area where Morgan Stanley would struggle. So what I did early on in my career, before Morgan Stanley actually partnered with my Management Leadership for Tomorrow, now they've been a partner with the organization for several years. It's an organization that supports underrepresented minorities in the U.S. with navigating their career. I went and I pitched them on this organization, and I pitched it first to the head of diversity and inclusion, who was supportive of the organization, but in the early years, that wasn't enough, like, in order to move the needle. So then I started going and started pitching it to, managing directors, and eventually we found a managing director in sales and trading that was like, yeah, we definitely should be sponsoring this program. As soon as we found that person, and he became vocal about it, oftentimes getting the line managers behind fixing some of these things, if they're passionate about it, that tends to move things at large organizations. So I think that that's what I've done that in a BCG context as well, and just like reaching out to the people who are either running diversity inclusion, or who are running training initiatives, and just bringing your idea in terms of like, how can you do this, how can you improve something, and start by improving it in a small way. So in the context of BCG, I mentioned, hey, if we bring in a little bit more personal storytelling into the training program, it's going to be really helpful, because a lot of consultants kind of start, and then right off the bat, they don't necessarily feel like they had a clear understanding of what to expect in the first few days of or months of the job. If we just bring in some recent hires and have them talk about their early days, that would be really helpful. That's led to kind of me, actually, the person who runs training for Southeast Asia was like, okay, we can pilot this in one of the sessions. How about you share your story, which I did. And in that first session that I shared, they get survey results at the end of each of these trainings. So they have 15, 20 different sessions, and then you'll rate them all on the basis of which session was most impactful, which facilitator did you find most helpful. And then after I did this training the first time, it was the #1 ranked session from the consultants, and then it's like, okay, now I got invited to do it again, and now I'm getting invited to do it again. And now this puts me on the radar with the person who's running the trainings. And so I'd say that the trick is to identify that something isn't working the way that it should be, and then find the senior person who's supposed to be making sure that it's working, and then find a very tangible way to improve that process. They're going to appreciate it. You're basically just you're helping them with their job. and you're doing it in your quote unquote free time, because, you know, if you're not reporting to them, you'd have no obligation to do it. So you're just giving them extra resources and bandwidth and so forth. So that's usually how I tackle things when I see things in a work environment that aren't running all cylinders and feel like they should be. Davion, I'll either turn it over to you or we can go to the question.
No, I think that's perfect. We can go to the next question. I think there's probably a few more
Cool.
out there that we can shed some insight on.
Awesome. Arija, see you're on as well, so I'll turn it over to you.
Hi there, thank you so much. So one question I have for the both of you is, what are some of the common career mistakes you see young people make early on when they start their careers?
It's funny. I think one of the, which is kind of ironic to your question, I think one of the mistakes that we all tend to make when we first start off is being, again, hyper focused on the mistakes that we may make, right? Which again is a bit ironic in the sense that when you get to your job, obviously you want to excel and you want to do well. But what you also want to realize is that you have the full benefit, especially when you're junior in your career, of saying, you know, I don't know, or I need, or you know, I don't know everything is what I would say, right? And so I think the first few months of you being on the job, you should kind of have a mentality of failing fast. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that, but right, this concept that the faster you fail, the quicker you learn, right? And then the quicker you're able to kind of, you know, chop down that time frame in terms of learning curve. And so I would say, you know, while it's important to be cognizant of where you may fall short, I wouldn't be hyper focused on all the mistakes you're making within the first few months of joining a position, because what you'll find is that, one, you're probably not the only one making those mistakes at your level, right? And two, if you're focused on the mistakes you're making, right, you're not, it's going to do that thing where it kind of eats at your own ability to feel as though you can do your job properly, right? And so I would take those with a grain of salt, the mistakes that you're making in the beginning. And the other thing that I think we tend to do on the onset of our careers that I think is a bit of a mistake is not being more patient with the overall process, right? Again, I don't take for granted that everyone on this call is probably really ambitious in their own regard, right? And that's great. But what we do have to realize is, in order to essentially set yourself up for, you know, point Z on your list, you really do have to take time and care to develop yourself at, you know, the current point in time. And so while it's great to think about exit opportunities and, you know, how you're going to get to that next mentor and how you're going to do this next thing or idea, it's also probably more important to make sure that in the seat you currently sit in, whether that's college, right, whether that's a beginning analyst position, whether that's a beginning kind of sales position at another firm, that you're doing your best to capitalize there, because that's ultimately is going to be the biggest platform for you to get to, you know, the next part of your career trajectory.
Awesome. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Davion. I think that covers it up well. We'll keep going just to be able to touch on a lot of questions. Rona, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate you, Davion. I'm sorry. Yes, Davion. I met you at Morgan Stanley like 2 years ago, and I don't know if you remember me, but I'll be joining Morgan Stanley this coming summer. And I just wanted to ask you, I know you touched on it a little bit. How do you make an impact, you know, just from the get-go of your career? I know you talked about some nervousness and how you had to find yourself, but just within that space and within that time, how are you still able to make an impact?
Yeah, no, that's very valid. So I kind of operate with a few different, you know, mantras for myself when it comes to career. And one of the mantras is you want to be doing things that your competition is not doing, right? Again, all going back to this idea that if we want to be a part of these select groups of people, and if we want to be a part, invited to the table, as such, so forth and so on, we need to be able to show reasons as to why, other than I'm smart and, you know, I can carry a conversation from time to time. And so what I did, actually, one of the things I did tangibly in my first internship was I noticed that there was like a rotational internships, right, which happens a lot at a lot of the bigger firms. And they give you about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks on one desk in order to kind of give you a crash course in whether it is, you know, selling bonds, selling stocks, investment banking, capital markets, whatever have you. And I noticed that there wasn't a ton of transparency between the work that I was doing and what the person who ultimately was going to be deciding whether I got this internship saw. And so I made it a responsibility on my part that at the end of every week, I would draft a list of who I'd met over the course of that week, across which departments or what levels they were on, what projects I was working on, and kind of what my position and role was there, and where I thought I was effective, as well as maybe one or two kind of like quick thoughts that were relevant to whatever, transaction or process we were running for that particular week, right? And so I would do, and I would CC my manager, the staffing manager, and maybe like the associate or whoever was, supposed to be kind of directly, I was supposed to directly report into. And I did that every week. And one, it gave me really good insight to know that I was doing a lot of things, and I was also kind of checking boxes off of my own personal list. But two, again, what it did was it created a track record for me, saying that this kid is getting things done. He's engaged with the organization. He's meeting people, right? And so instinctively, right, if you're smart about it, the people I'm putting in the first few lines of the people that I met are people who I know I've already garnered their kind of support for. And so if you want to turn around and kind of fact check me on some of the relationships that I build, you can do that. And then you double down to another person within my network that is also supportive of me, right? And so that's a tangible example of, I think, some of the things that I did to kind of set myself apart. But you only get there by starting with the mentality that, okay, well, if all my peers are setting up calls, if all my peers are doing this, is there something else that I can really be doing that can kind of separate myself for this particular process or endeavor? So that's what I would kind of respond to that question. And Triston, feel free to chime in.
Awesome. No, I think that hits it nicely. I'm aligned there. Unless Rona, any follow-up questions there, or if not, we will kind of continue going on to other people that have submitted.
Not really. Thank you so much for that.
Awesome. No, thank you again for joining.
Congrats on your job.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, congrats that you're starting this summer. I apologize. I completely blanked on that part.
Thank you.
Jacob, I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Triston. And thanks, Davion, for taking the time to speak with us. So you both mentioned how you started at Morgan Stanley and then you're at different external firms now. And Davion, you mentioned how you started in sales and trading role and then you moved to an investment banking role. And so my question is about internal mobility and how do you kind of navigate that process and how do you make the decision point on these are my goals and aspirations, and like what was your thought process to get in the seat that you eventually wanted to be in?
Yeah, so I'm happy to touch on that. And then Davion, I do actually want you to touch on this one as well, because I think you'll have a different perspective and a helpful perspective that will build on it. But from my perspective, so I started out in investment banking and then I transitioned into a sales and trading role. And then I transitioned into a strategy role that was focused on increasing business with Asian, Black, and Hispanic clients. And then I transitioned into a role within human resources and talent management. So in my 5 or 6 years at Morgan Stanley, I worked in 4 or 6 different divisions. And in my 5 or 6 years at Morgan Stanley, I worked in 4 different divisions, and it was not a part of a rotational program. It was just me raising my hand every so often and kind of looking for the next opportunity. I'd say part of what will help you in terms of navigating the internal mobility process is really knowing people in other divisions. So I made it a point, if most companies will have, like, if you open up your web browser, there's a Morgan Stanley Today homepage, and it will share kind of random stories about people throughout the firm that are doing different things. I'd actually read those articles and I'd look at the names, and then I would send emails to the people that I thought were interesting. I'd look them up on LinkedIn. I would see, is there something we have in common? Are we both passionate about mentorship? Do we both kind of come from, a certain part of the world? Do we, like whatever it might be, I would look for points of commonality and I would actually follow up with them. And so I knew people in what others would say were like random parts of the firm, but like everything fits into the bigger picture of knowing how Morgan Stanley operates, and was helpful from that perspective. And so the first thing I would say is make sure that you know people in other parts of the firm. The second thing is that'll help because you'll also hear when opportunities open up. So when I first went from investment banking to sales and trading, it was because I knew people in sales and trading, and I knew of this team called Senior Relationship Management, and I knew that there was one person on the team who was actually leaving, and I knew how their coverage model worked. And that means, like, as soon as somebody leaves, I knew that there's a very sharp need to fill somebody kind of immediately. And so I'd say that is one thing. The other thing is having the support of your group internally, your current seat. I also knew at that time that in investment banking, a lot of people, the firm was trying to keep people in the seat that they were in as opposed to losing them to hedge funds and private equity firms and so forth. So I kind of aware of that knowledge, I was able to go to my investment banking team and basically say, look, I know that we're trying to make a really big push to keep people in house and that most people are leaving from banking into these opportunities. I'm actually interested in this opportunity. It's a little bit sooner than would be normal for me to make the switch, but I think it's best for, I think it'd be good for Morgan Stanley. I think it'd be good for this team. And I think it'd be good for myself, and basically make that argument so that my current team can then go to my next team and say, okay, like, fine if Triston kind of takes on this new role, and like, they say they put that in a very supportive way. So I think the tone that your current team sets about you is also really important, especially when it comes to internal mobility. It's even more important than when it comes to kind of external searches for jobs, because they don't know, whenever you're getting feedback on a person externally, you don't know if that person has the same definition of what kind of, what good looks like, versus internally colleagues, somebody at Morgan Stanley has a much clearer definition of what it takes to succeed at Morgan Stanley. And so what your previous team thinks of you is going to be really important. So I'd say, touch base with people very broadly, make sure you have your team support. And the final thing is, like, you have to prepare yourself as though you are going to start that job, and you have to be able to perform at the level that that new job is looking for you on day one. And that's different than when you're joining, like, out of college into investment banking. They're kind of not expecting you to perform as an investment banking analyst from day one, because they know that there's this training and kind of period where you build yourself. If you're coming from, let's say in Davion's case, you were coming from sales and trading, they're going to expect that he can do the job of an investment banking analyst on day one, which means in order to do that, he's going to have to do a lot of kind of prep outside of the actual job before he kind of is able to move into investment banking, which is why, Davion, I'll turn it over to you, because this is why I want you to touch on it, because I remembered that at Morgan Stanley, especially when I was in investment banking, there were so many people that, like, came to me and were like, Triston, I want to switch into investment banking from all of these different divisions. And I tell them, okay, well, you need to, like, learn financial modeling, and you need to teach this to yourself first before you go. And, like, I probably had this conversation with over 100 people. And Davion was one of two people that actually did it. Him and another guy, JJ, who's a mutual friend of ours, were the only two people who actually, like, they did it. They came to courses, they prepared for it, they did what they needed to do to actually be able to perform on the job. Whereas most people, the other 98, I think, had this mindset that they were going to first secure the job and then learn on the job. But that's for internal mobility and switching over, that's just not how it works. You need to be able to perform at the level of the role you're moving into on day one. So, and I think Davion kind of did that and was able to demonstrate that. So I'll turn it over to you to kind of speak about, I guess, that transition from sales and trading to banking.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. It's one of the questions I love being asked, particularly when I'm on the line with Triston, because to what he just said, he actually helped facilitate my transition from sales and trading to investment banking. So I'll give you maybe a quick peek rather at why I decided to kind of make that transition, and then I can kind of go a bit more, granular in terms of how I made the transition. So I started off at Morgan Stanley. I'm in sales and trading. I'm selling bonds to the institutional clients that we had. And at one point, it was just kind of corporate bonds, like for Verizon and blue chip companies, and I enjoyed that a lot. And then about 4 months into that new job, my boss tapped me on my shoulder and he said, "Hey, Davion, everyone loves the work you're doing here. And it just so happens that we lost headcount on the municipal bond desk. Would you be willing to make the transition?" Right. And obviously there's this subtle or implicit, we're asking, but in reality, we're gonna put you in this new seat. And I remember thinking to myself, well, if I can have such little autonomy over my career so earlier on, then I need to start thinking a bit more thoughtfully and a bit more intentionally about where I wanted to end up in life. And so what I realized was that, while I was selling bonds for these companies, I didn't know the companies, right? I didn't know really why they were making the rationale to raise capital. I didn't really know what their history had been in terms of their strategic outlook and how are they going to use that to kind of manifest whatever goals they had, right? And so I thought to myself, well, sales and trading has been great in terms of allowing me to learn new content on the fly and developing a thicker skin and being more, decisive, all that good stuff. But what it doesn't allow me to do is to kind of look under the hood about the decisions that a company's making. And that's where I want to be dangerous. And so I had a few conversations with mentors, and they said, well, you can go to research or you can go to investment banking. And those are the two options they gave me. And from there, I started to reach out to Tristan's point in terms of my internal network at Morgan Stanley. And I first started off with that fundamental level, again, why it's important about the peer network. I started off with the kids who are already in banking, right? Who graduated from Villanova with me or who graduated from Penn, who I knew from down the street, right? Because again, when you go through these lateral movements, when you talk to anybody who's in a position of power to put you in that position, they're going to assume you know the job, right? And that you have full context over what you're getting yourself into. And so what I did after meeting Triston, right? Actually, I had a meeting with Carl Harris, right? Because again, you want the senior champion. And one of the things I learned from Carlo was that when you go into the office with someone senior, for the most part, try not to go without an ask, like a tangible ask to them at the end, right? Because otherwise you go in and you say hi and you give a little pitch about yourself and they give you some anecdote about their life, but there's nothing that can consistently connect you anymore, right? Whereas if you go in with a follow-up, there's typically a reason for you to reach back out to that person, right? Or vice versa. And so my request was for Carla. I said, I know you're terribly busy, but I really am thinking about investment banking as a career transition. Would you be able to put me in touch with someone more junior on your team who you think can kind of coach me through that process? And she says, of course, follow me. And I was like, of course, follow me. And about Tristan, 7 feet outside of her office was an associate Tristan sitting at the desk, and she introduced me to Tristan. She goes, Tristan, Davion wants to do banking. Can you help him out? And Tristan's like, happily. And we sat down, and Tristan gave that one speech that I'm pretty sure he gave to 100 times before. And I said, wow, like this is a lot more than I bargained for in terms of what I needed to prepare for to make this transition. However, I made a decision, and therefore I'm going to follow through on that. And so a part of that checklist, and I'll wrap up, but a part of that checklist was essentially, reading all the Wall Street Oasis guides, right? Actually studying them. So if sales and trading ended at, 6 p.m., call it my regular work day, I would stay into the office until 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock to kind of study those guides. Once I felt as though I was really well rehearsed and kind of, at least conversationally speak the language, I started to reach out to the other analysts in banking at Morgan Stanley just to have mock interviews, right? And so again, I'm doing all of this before I had even really approached anyone from HR. So by the time that I did get to the HR representative, I presented them. This is the other point. So if your network and kind of doing the underground work is the one lesson, right? And knowing the job before you have to apply, that's the first lesson. The second lesson is there's always somebody who's doing the same thing that you're doing who's coming right after you. And so what I did when I met with HR or anyone who I thought could be helpful was I presented them with like a 2-pager kind of like overview. And it had 4 quadrants basically. The first quadrant was who I was, right? And kind of where my expertise was and what I thought my value add was. The second quadrant was why I wanted to do the position of an investment banker. The third quadrant was what I'd been doing to prepare for that position, right? And then the fourth quadrant was what I call kind of like my magic box, what the person opposite of me could do to help me further this goal into getting to investment banking, right? And so I think, again, my mindset was everyone is coming in here asking for the same stuff, making phone calls. If I can do something, in this case, give them something tangible that separated me, then I think it'll go a long way. And it did. And so those are the 2 things that I would say. And then the last piece of advice when you're moving laterally is to kind of move with a bit of boldness, especially within the fields of like finance and consulting and some of these more competitive fields. What you'll notice is kind of this idea that closed mouths don't get fed. And so if I was in front of anybody who could help me, I was making bold statements. I was saying, absolutely, I'm 2 feet into this. I know I'm prepared for these, really long work weeks because, again, this is really in line with my thesis of who I want to be as a person, right? And so, and mind you, in the back of my mind, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm about to do, right? In terms of getting myself into kind of the deep end of this financial world. But when you're in front of those people, it's okay to make bold moves. It's okay to kind of, make sure that they know that you're capable of what you came to do. And so those are kind of the tidbits that I would share in terms of transitioning internally.
And thank you, Jacob, for the question. I think it's actually an important thing to kind of keep in mind, because a lot of these companies that we're at, we get recruited into one role and then you quickly believe that that role is the entire company. For me, my perspective was Morgan Stanley and investment banking were synonymous. And at one point I was really unhappy in investment banking, but I liked Morgan Stanley, and I was going to quit. And I talked to a mentor of mine, and my mentor was basically like, there's 55,000 employees at Morgan Stanley. Like, have you actually checked to see, is there like another seat at the firm that you'd be more excited in? Have you actually looked at that and considered that before quitting? And I hadn't. And then as soon as I did my research and I came across sales and trading, I was like, okay, this feels like a role that I would like more. And it also, I get to stay at this company, which again, I liked. I just didn't like investment banking. And so I think that's it's a really good question. I'm mindful of time. I know that there's more questions. So what we will do is we can do a very quick wrap, Davion. But for those, so Quentin, Garrett, Loris, Olu, Kelsey, I haven't forgot. I know you all have questions. I don't have a hard stop, so I will kind of stay on the line. Davion, I don't know if you have a hard stop or not. If okay, so we can stay on the line. But maybe just to be respectful of everybody's time, we'll just do a quick close. So I just want to share a few additional resources, because it's one of the questions that I get asked is, are there books, sources, and so forth. So Davion, can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay, cool. So I'd say from a book perspective, if there are 3 books that I felt like were really impactful for me related to this topic, the first is Strategize to Win from Carla Harris. Davion and I have both mentioned this a tremendous amount, but I think I would have put this, book on the list even if I didn't personally know Carla. What is unique about the book is just how incredibly practical the things in that book are in terms of what you need to do to take yourself to the next level. So that would be without a doubt the number 1 book that I would read. The number 2 book that I would read would be, there's this book called The 100-Year Life. And it's all about how the average person in a developed world is going to live to be has a 50% chance of living to be over 100 years old, and how that has to change the way that you think of your life. So we oftentimes hear the adage, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. But especially early on in my career, it sure felt like a sprint. I think this book helped put it into the broader perspective of life and helped me actually appreciate a little bit more that it's a marathon. And so I think from a career perspective, this book gave me a lot of comfort and perspectives that were very valuable in rethinking how I structure my career. And then the last book is How Will You Measure Your Life by Clay Christensen, who's a very well-known Harvard Business School professor, who unfortunately really passed away very recently. But incredible book where basically he takes many of the commonly used business frameworks and applies them to how you can use this business framework and think about it in the context of your life, and what it means to have a meaningful life and so forth. So those are 3 books that I found incredibly helpful. And then the last 2 are journals, which is just, we've talked a lot about kind of charting your own path, listening to yourself. Journaling has been a big part of what has allowed me to be able to do that effectively. And so there's 2 journals in particular. One is called One Line a Day. It's basically a 5-year journal where you write like the equivalent of a Twitter-sized journal entry every single day, but you're able to see, okay, what was I doing on March 28th of 2021, and what was I doing, how does that compare to a year ago from that exact day? So, March 28th, 2020, 2019, 2018, and you can really see the evolution of yourself in a very visible way, which is cool. And then the Q&A one is basically the same exact concept, except it actually poses a question to you. So that is just some quick resources that I think I've found helpful related to this topic. Please do feel free to follow up with either Davion or myself if you have any questions. So feel free, the best way is to just shoot us a message on LinkedIn, either at those URLs or the QR code will also pop up our LinkedIn account, or fairly easy to find us if you just search Davion Lewis TPG and Triston Francis BCG. It should be easy to find us there. And lastly, I host a lot of these different events. So if there's a topic that you want to discuss, feel free to reach out to me. A list of the upcoming events is in the QR code all the way to the left, or feel free to stay in touch. I always announce the events on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. So feel free to kind of follow me there if you're interested in being kept in the loop regarding those events. And with that, we can pause here. Anybody who has to drop off the call at this point, please do feel free to drop off. Davion and I will stay on so that we can continue resuming. I just wanted to do a proper close and say a proper thank you to everybody as we come up on the hour, because we're at time. So with that, please do feel free to drop off. Thank you so much for dialing in. Really appreciate it, and hope to see you again. Great. So now we can go ahead and continue with the questions. Quentin, I'll turn it over to you, Quentin, and then Garrett, I'll turn it over to you after that.
First off, I want to thank you guys both for hosting this event. Actually been to an in-person one a couple years ago, so great to see you guys again. What I wanted to touch on was Davion's point of doing well in the capacity that you're currently in. So whether that be you trying to pivot to another section within the bank, or you being a college student. With most of us being like undergraduates on this call, I wanted to see if you guys could kind of highlight how undergraduate performance kind of affects you as you begin your career. So like, yeah, the session is based upon, starting off well in your career, but I don't feel like it's, I guess, touched upon enough, like how important like your grades are in undergrad for like, pivoting to a firm like TPG or going to HBS. I want to know if you guys could kind of touch on that.
Yeah, I think that the further you move away from college, the less important your grades are going to be. Meaning, like for your first job, your grades are probably going to be more important, or they are going to be more important than for your fifth job. I'd say that in the context of it really depends on what's the environment that you're going in and how do they gain confidence that you will be an effective hire. So if we translate that to HBS, at the end of the day, HBS wants to just make sure that when they bring students in, they're going to be able to perform and they're going to do well in the classroom. But any way that you can give them confidence is sufficient. Now, one of the ways that you can give them confidence is to have like a 4.0 GPA and a really strong like GMAT score. If you have a 4.0 GPA and a 790 GMAT, HBS is pretty sure that you're going to be fine in terms of the classroom. Now, that doesn't mean that HBS is going to admit you. They're actually admitting you very holistically, because they're asking themselves, what is this person going to actually bring to the class, which again goes to your strengths more so than anything else. But like that's the equivalent of the table stakes, to bring it full circle. And for an HBS is like the table stakes is that you're going to perform well in the classroom, but that's not going to get you into the school. But so in that case, a 4.0 and a 790 GMAT score, like that's one way to prove to HBS that you're going to be fine academically. Honestly, another way to prove is like, what are you doing work-wise, right? So if you're doing investment banking at Morgan Stanley, they're going to care that your GPA is going to be less of a question mark. My GPA had a B+ average. I don't think HBS really cared that I had a B+ average, because I was working at Morgan Stanley. There wasn't really a question in their mind, is Triston going to be able to succeed in the context of HBS? The combination of a B++ from having gone to Wharton for undergrad, they were like, okay, Triston's going to be, able to be fine in the classroom. And I was able to kind of explain, like, look, I know that my GPA is lower than, I think the average at HBS is like 3.6 or 3.7. I was able to explain, look, my GPA is lower than my peers. I was working 3 jobs while I was in college, and I was kind of paying for my day-to-day stuff. And so that means I had less time for classes, and therefore, a lower GPA. And like that was it. So I guess I would say it depends on the context of the firm that you're applying to. and the role that you're applying into. And if it's, oftentimes these like investing roles, and Davion, I'll turn it over to you for that, but like oftentimes these investing roles like to see people that were summa cum laude or graduated at the top of their class or things like that. So that might be important in the context of some organizations, but for some that's not really a prerequisite. So it does depend on the role very much. But I'll turn it to you, Davion.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I obviously agree with everything Triston said. The GPA is definitely going to be the kind of the road of least resistance when it comes to your employers being able to assess, what your ability is to thrive in their organization. That being said, I'll be candid. My freshman year of college, I didn't do too hot. And that was for a number of reasons. That was because it was a new environment where I felt as though I didn't really belong, and there was a lot of imposter syndrome going on. It was also the case that I was just not in the best mental state then in terms of like being able to progress my own self. And so my GPA suffered my freshman year, and along with a friend of mine, Kai Cunningham, who he ended up working at Goldman Sachs and has now become a founding VP at this venture capital fund. But we both we looked at each other and we said, hey, so we want to do this, and right now in terms of GPA and performance, we're kind of doing this, right? So how do you bridge the gap? I think you always want to, again, GPA is important, but if you're decided on something and that's your ultimate goal, I'm a proponent of there's always a way to get there, right? Again, the GPA is the road of least resistance, but if you want to get somewhere, there's always a way. You just have to make sure, one, you have enough time to kind of make up for that gap, wherever that may be. And then two, you're augmenting your strengths while working on some of those weaknesses, right? Because when you apply to these jobs, it's more of a portfolio, right? GPA check, school check, volunteer work, leadership, ability to be creative, whatever the case may be, there's a portfolio. And when you assess your portfolio, you want to see, okay, well, where's my weakness? Where's the blind spot? If yours is GPA, okay, well, what I did in that instance was Kai and I, our sophomore year, we went on basically a very strict, like, we're trying to get after our goals type of semester. We paused all partying for 2 semesters. We were roommates, and each Saturday we would do something that was productive towards getting internships at these really big firms. A lot of times it ended up being like an hour of just kind of cold networking and calling and things of that nature. But the point is that we were trying to figure out how to, shorten this gap. Had a really successful outing sophomore year in terms of performance and so forth and so on. But I also knew, again, these guys had 3.8s, and I had a really not great freshman year. And so what else could I do? Okay, well, if not for my GPA, the working experience. Let me try to corral as many great working experiences at a Morgan Stanley, at a Goldman Sachs, at whatever firms as I can, so that, again, when I'm a candidate saying, I want you to hire me full time, it's like, yeah, well, this is a question mark, but boom, 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 right? And so I would just say the sooner you can think about how to fill the gaps in your portfolio, the more tangible that goal will still be, although it's going to come down to, again, well, how many more calories are you going to be willing to put into achieving this goal?
Great, thank you. And Garrett, we'll turn it over to you.
Hey Tristan, and hey Davion, it was great to meet both of you today. So I had like a quick follow-up to the answer you gave about internal mobility. I was just kind of curious if your advice on or perspective on internal mobility within firms is still, if you would apply the same advice to stuff in the consulting world in terms of office transfers, like case demand transfers, short-term office transfers, or even secondments. And then the question. Yeah. Well, sorry.
Oh, no. No, you can go ahead and ask the second part to the question, and then I'll just, I'll maybe I'll write it
the
down.
second question was just, I think a lot of banking and consulting firms and, a lot of these careers in finance and business pride themselves on being meritocracies, but obviously that isn't always the case. And I was just kind of curious your guys' perspective about navigating institutions and bureaucracies that are not always completely fair when it comes to so maybe advice on managing relationships and stuff like that.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. So Davion, I'll go ahead and answer the first one since it's consulting specific, and then I'll turn it over to you for the second one on meritocracy. But in terms of the transitions from like office to office, secondments and so forth within consulting, I think when it comes to transitioning from office to office, and when I say this, obviously I kind of went through the transition from BCG's Philly office to transferring into BCG's Singapore office. Those transfers are, for the majority of times, taking place because for some personal reason, an employee has kind of requested to move. And I think that when it comes to consulting and office transfers, the single most important thing is just what is your current performance. If you're performing well at a consulting firm, and they're very structured in terms of you get feedback and formal quantitative rankings, and you get that like pretty much every 10 weeks roughly, and that it gets calculated and weighted averages to come up with scores across all of these different dimensions. So it's easy for these consulting firms to say, and then they put you in quartiles, and it's easy for them to say, like, if you're a first quartile consultant in New York and you want to move to another office in North America, that's very likely that they will be able to kind of make that work if you can just explain to them why it is that you're looking to move. So performance becomes critically important there. The same is actually true for secondments for the most part. So when you're evaluating a secondment, the number one thing that they're looking at is, do we already have confidence that you are ready for the next level? So if you're a consultant and you're looking to do a secondment, they're asking themselves, do you already have the skills to basically be a project leader? If the answer to that question is yes, then they're comfortable with you going and doing the secondment because you already have from their mind what it takes to kind of perform at the next level. If they're not sure, then one of two things. If you're too close to the promotion window, you probably will not get the blessing to do the secondment because they're not sure that you can come back in time and develop the skills needed before getting promoted to the next level. So you might get told no to the secondment. If you've just transitioned, so sometimes people will like just get promoted from consultant into project leader and then right away they'll do the secondment. That tends to be okay, because from their perspective, you probably don't have the skills yet to be promoted to principal, but it's fine because you were just promoted to project leader. So you can go do the secondment, then come back into the role, and you have enough runway before your promotion window to actually get promoted before you need to. So that's kind of how it works from an office and from a secondment perspective. And then there's also internal mobility in the context of consulting firms, which is actually I'm very much looking into that right now. There's 3 different roles. One of them is a global sector manager for the industrials sector for BCG, which I'm looking at. It's basically a business development role. How do we grow the sector? Another is managing the people agenda for TMT globally, which is like who are the BCGers that are working on TMT projects, and how do we kind of keep them in this practice area and so forth. And then the third is managing learning and development for Asia Pacific. So these are kind of like 3 internal opportunities that I'm looking at kind of right now as we speak. And so I think that internal mobility there is probably similar to what I described earlier in terms of how internal mobility works when you're looking to go from like a banking to a sales and trading to a, to strategy, HR, and so forth. There are, similar to Morgan Stanley, there's a ton of roles that are not what people typically think of when they think of BCG that are really interesting roles. And I actually think that mobility at consulting firms is a really cool place to think about mobility and the type of stuff that you can do and so forth. So that's how I would describe it in the consulting context. Davion, I'll turn it over to you for the second part of that question in terms of navigating these environments that aren't necessarily always meritocratic, even though there can sometimes be projected to be so, and kind of how you kind of transition and navigate through that.
Yeah. Which I think the idea of the world being, or these businesses being a meritocracy, it does sound nice, and I think it is what we would like to kind of hang our hats on. But I think the piece of the formula, right, is okay. Well, what are we doing, and how well am I working, and then what is the perception and transparency into what am I doing from my organization's viewpoint, right? And typically, what I've found is that what what prevents that promotion or that recognition is usually the second part of it, right? No one is openly saying that you're not working hard, you're not intelligent, right? But what may be actually happening is that you're not promoting yourself as such as well as you would think, right? I think I've felt fallen victim in the past to saying, well, I just pulled X amount of, all-nighters, and I had this deliverable last week that went really well, and I just led this client meeting, right? They have to be able to see, how valuable I am, right? And this thought process of assuming that they're automatically seeing it is where I think you can find some difficulty. And so with that mindset, I think what you should kind of transfer some of your waking hours with is, well, how can I provide more visibility again into what I'm doing, right? How can I be my own best advocate? Because the only way in which you're not going to be promoted into an organization is if, one, they don't recognize you, right? Because they just don't see it. Or two, they see it and for whatever reason, they choose to give it to someone else that has whatever competitive advantage. If it's the second case scenario, then sometimes it is the case where you may find greater value for yourself outside of that firm, right? But typically I would say it's the first scenario. And so what I would do is try to get more comfortable having an open dialogue with the people you're reporting into about, what you expect and what your performance is like, right? So I think, again, instead of like typing in a goal into, a database once or twice a year, it's really about, okay, well, so-and-so manager, I think for me, and this is what I said actually when I joined TPG, I said, for me, what I believe I should be doing here is, making sure that I can be promoted to senior associate, right? So that's my goal. And I would like to know that if these, intermediary goals are what I should be thinking about in terms of tracking to this ultimate goal, right? So boom, before a month has passed from me being at TPG, the people who need to be aware know that I'm not trying to leave in 2 years, right? They know that my goal is to kind of move upwards into that community, right? And they've also given me confirmation that the 3 intermediary goals that I've created for myself is a conduit to getting to where I need to be, right? And so I think having that conversation or those conversations over time, again, assuming you're performing in the actual day-to-day task, are ways that you're not left kind of at the bottom of their minds when decisions need to be made.
Awesome. Great, thank you. And thank you again, Garrett, for the questions. Maybe just to keep going through, I know there's a few others on the line. Loris, if you're still on the line, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. Great meeting both of you. I'm in operation at Morgan Stanley, and maybe in 2 years, I would like to go to capital market or institutional equity division. And I'd like to know, what resources do you think I should use to learn how to do financial modeling and business valuation?
Davion, I'll leave that one to you, since you were in the role of actually kind of being at Morgan Stanley and then making that switch over.
Yeah. And let me know if any of these are repetitive, but I would say that the typical suspects in that regard are Wall Street Oasis, the Vault Guides, and there's one more that's escaping me. Mergers and acquisitions, right? Those are just websites and sources that give you like literally 200 to 300 page kind of what I would call Bibles in terms of how to kind of navigate investment banking roles or financial modeling. You said your question was more about capital markets. So those resources will have kind of overviews of what capital markets are, but the actual modeling that you're looking to garner will probably be helpful because they do offer corporate finance pieces as well, which I do think is still relevant for the capital markets roles. And then, I mean, as Kristen, does SEO, like, what's the cutoff? Because I know SEO does a bunch of like actual training for modeling, but I'm not sure if that's like for early professionals or if it's just for college students.
My understanding is that it is just for people. I haven't seen them do things kind of externally for if you're not kind of in the SEO program. And if you're, so I think it's just students, but worth asking the question. So what I would recommend doing is finding somebody who's currently at Morgan Stanley and is at SEO. When I was at Morgan Stanley, I was the SEO firm captain. I have no idea who is the SEO firm captain now, But there is, I am sure, somebody who's an SEO firm captain. I would find that person and pose that specific question to him or her, and they, have them double check on that, because there might not be a formal way of doing it, but there's always where there's a will, there's always a way. And so they might be able to get you some helpful resources, or invite you to some events just because they have a good relationship with SEO and you've asked them. So I would definitely pose that question to them as well. Davion, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, and then the other one that comes to mind is training the street. So training the street is also a good just kind of resource for those types of information. But I do think Tristan's point shouldn't be taken lightly. What I just gave you in terms of like resources, right? Those are like you read it, you understand the world you're in, right? And you kind of have more context for what you're going for. The actual way to dig in, I would say, to learning really how to model and to know where you should be is through the personal aspect, right? So again, for me, it was, once I understood what I had to do, it was checking in with some of the analysts that were at Morgan Stanley in those roles already, right? Articulating my view that I wanted to be, a part of this kind of career trajectory path, why I wanted to do that, and then enlisting their help as I went through some of the more technical pieces of the analysis, right? And I found a lot of supporters. I found them to be very open, again, if you're genuine about it. I think, while they're still analysts, their time is still very valuable. So I would say still only approach them once you've kind of figured out that this is what you want to do and you have a story to tell as to why you want to do it. But after that, you'll win a bunch of support. And you'll find that people are very willing to kind of check over the quick merger model that you did, or check over the ROI analysis that you did to make sure that there isn't anything that you're missing. That's where I've received a lot of my support as well as feedback when it came to like the technical skills.
Awesome.
And again, the worst thing that people can say is no. That's also something to be really mindful of. I don't think I don't remember a lot of the no's that I've gotten back in my short tenure out of college when asking for help, because the yeses that I got back were the ones that I needed, and those are the people that are still in my circle today. And so, a lot of this requires outreach if you're trying to, move internally. It requires you to put yourself out there in front of a lot of people, which can be uncomfortable. But always take the shot, because, to the earlier point, you miss, 100% of the ones you don't take.
Awesome. Thank you, and good luck as you're navigating your way through this process. It takes a lot of kind of remaining committed to the goal, as Davion had touched on earlier. But I think if you remain committed to it and you put in the hours, I think it is much more attainable than people think. Usually people fall off the track from either losing focus or just not putting in the hours that it requires to do what it is. But good luck with that. Olu, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tristan and Davion. So yeah, calling in from Nairobi, Kenya, it's kind of very early at setting alarm. But yeah, my question is largely around, so I got into a CEO role in my career. So I was serving as a technical advisor to the CEO. And I feel like, that was like a really high growth thing just coming out of college. So I'm 19 months in. And I wanted to ask, so I already got a space at the table very early on, but now pivoting into a different role out of the company, I wanted to ask, how do you continually improve your skills from, being on the table stakes? How do you then pivot that into, get into a space where like you are consistently growing year on year, or you're consistently growing enough to be, for lack of a better word, sexy for different organizations? Because yeah, I think it's kind of very important. And for example, I tried to apply to BCG and TPG at some point. TPG kind of invested in the business we're working right now, and definitely, I got my nose, but like David said, probably when the years come, those are the ones I use. But to be able to pivot during that period, how do I think about it? How do I take that step year on year?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for dialing in. And I know it is 3:30 in the morning in Nairobi, so I think that's actually a good example of, just the hunger and the ambition. And I think that the people that I've seen who have been willing to do this, not that I think, I think sleep is fantastic, like very important. And I think I would for sure prioritize sleep as much as you can, but I think the willingness to every now and then kind of take calls at 3 o'clock in the morning and that kind of thing, I think will set you up well. To your question though, in terms of kind of how do you demonstrate improvement kind of year over year and continue to excel, I think as you progress, in my case, it's always applying what you've learned in like a new setting and with increased responsibility. And as you're doing that, it will set you up for more successes and more failures. And then you'll kind of learn as a result of that. So if I were to talk about kind of, going back to, I spoke earlier about writing and public speaking and my kind of quest to do some of that stuff. And in college, I took on a lot of leadership activities. And then at Morgan Stanley, I was able to test those leadership activities. And then I went to Harvard to get my MBA. And while I was on campus, I ended up becoming our student body co-president. And that was the biggest leadership opportunity that I had. I was co-leading a team of about 70 people. We had a budget of about 1.3 million USD to basically plan programming for both of the classes while I was there. And so again, I think that to this question of like, if I think about responsibility, it just increases with time. And now if I move into this, if I move into one of these internal roles that I had mentioned I'm looking at, in some instances, I'd be overseeing multi-million-dollar budgets and allocating where are we going to be kind of spending money to kind of develop our expertise in these areas. And so I think the opportunity to continually improve will come with continued responsibility. You do something at a micro level, you do it well, then you're given the opportunity to do it at a little bit bigger of a level. And then if if responsibility keeps on improving, that's how you end up in these seats where these people are running, multi-billion-dollar businesses. The CEOs of these organizations, eventually they were accomplishing tasks at a very micro level. And then they just kind of continue to demonstrate that improvement year over year, and the responsibility comes. The other thing that I'll say is really important for this notion of how do you continually improve is going to be, you need a mechanism for self-reflection and self-assessment in the midst of all of this, right? Because in college, you get these grades and you can look at yourself and say, okay, this is where I was last semester. This is where I am now. I feel like I improved in this area. That can be a little bit harder once you're actually working. You don't have those milestones in the same way that you did when you were in college. I think that you need to really, for me, I always try to have a coach. So I was able to get BCG to sign me up for a coach while I was here. Your coach, either hiring a coach, or if you can't hire a coach, then finding a friend that's going to be a coach, but being clear that like part of what the coaching needs to be is you kind of sharing very candidly and authentically what your experiences are, and then getting some very real feedback from that person. So you need to know how you're doing and have an accurate view of how you're doing. And then the last thing I'll say is, you mentioned that you have this seat at the table. So connected to what Davion was mentioning, when Carla gave him the advice of, when you speak to a senior person, make sure that you have an ask. So I think that in your case, it seems like you have the seat at the table, you have access to these people. Now the question is, make the ask. So if you're making the asks to people with a lot of influence, the opportunities are going to come. And if they're not coming, it means that there's still maybe some room for you to prove yourself in the eyes of that senior person. So get that done, knock it out of the park, because generally speaking, when you can get beyond that threshold and a person that is senior and influential is like, okay, I'm going to invest in this person because I know he or she is going to knock it out of the park, then that opens up doors that you don't even realize it will open up. So I guess that would be my big piece of advice there around that process of continually self-improving. But Davion, I'll turn it over to you in case there's anything to add there.
I think you said that really well. I think the only thing that maybe is not an addition, but more of a highlight or a double tap is you wanna be, well, trying to say, come back to me again. I lost my train of thought, but it's around the lines of, when you are seeking to kind of do something externally or something different, it's this idea of there's a couple core transferable skills that you'll need almost any job, right? And so I would take a look at your kind of the world that you live in, right? And say, well, what are the true characteristics when I look across this position at this firm and this position across this firm and this position across this firm? And what you'll find is that a lot of them require you to be just kind of like really good with ambiguous situations, right? At least in our world, right? So in the world that I live in, right, I need to be really good and skilled and well-versed on how do I get a project or a task and distill it to asking myself, what are the key questions that need to be answered for this project and task, right? And then figure out who are the people or teams that I would need to connect with in order to find these answers. And so for me, I really think it is about just looking at the industry or position you're in relative to the ones that you're trying to go to and finding, again, the transferableness of the skill sets. No, you may not be able to, do a technical model if you haven't been a banker before, but you probably are able to, again, be able to garner research and distill it to something that's very easy for the banker to digest in order to kind of come up with whatever analysis you need to do. And so it's not a perfect example, but I think, again, it's really about this idea that you're always going to be connected to some root strength of yours that you're going to use to improve as you seek different opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys.
Awesome. Thank you. No, thank you for the question, Olu, and thank you again for dialing in so early in the morning from Nairobi. Appreciate that. Rona, we'll turn it back over to you.
And there's a question also on the chat, I think, Triston, if we can maybe address that before we.
Oh, yeah. So maybe, Rona, we'll turn it over to you, and then we'll address that question right after this one.
All right, great. Again, thank you for taking the extra time. I know you talked a lot about, building relationships. I just want to ask you, are there any practical steps that one can take to ensure that they're constantly building genuine relationships with their co-workers, their peers, and also their supervisors and bosses?
Yeah.
In terms of maybe, I was going to say in terms of scheduling meetings, how often do you advise, reaching out to people and things like that?
Yeah, so a lot of thoughts on this topic, and I think it has evolved over time. I think when I was in college, I even at one point had like a spreadsheet that would automatically update in terms of how long has it been since I've reached out to this person. And I tried to be super kind of structured and rigid about it, and I would not advise that approach. I think that for me, if the question on your mind is how frequently do I have to reach out to this person, then that's probably a signal that you don't have the type of relationship with the person that you want to have with the person, and maybe a signal that that person isn't necessarily even the right person to have a relationship with, meaning the people who I want to have a relationship with and are the right people for me to have a relationship with, they will naturally come up in my mind, like going through life. And I will stay in touch with those people. And if I think of those people, they will be in my mind, right? So like Davion, as an example, he deeply cares about mentorship. Like I know that him and I are going to kind of stay in touch, broadly speaking, throughout our careers. We're 10,000 plus miles away, but I have no doubt that like there will be many conversations throughout life that him and I have. I don't have a spreadsheet anywhere with his name in it. I don't have a reminder that I'm setting to myself to do this. I just know that things are going to happen in life that are going to remind me of like navigating corporate America, that are going to remind me of Davion. And when that happens, I would follow up with him. So there have been moments where I've probably sent a random email or message or just like kind of checking in. In the instance of this event, I'm sure there was something that triggered a thought from Davion to say, it's been a while since we've done one of these events, and he actually reached out to me. So today's conversation was Davion reaching out and saying, hey, let's do an event on this topic. It's been a while since we've done something. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Would love. So I would say that the people that are good for you to stay in touch with, and that you have that kind of relationship with, it's going to be organic in terms of how you stay in touch with them and how often you stay in touch with them and so forth. And to the question of how do you build that relationship, I always try to connect with people out of a mutual point of commonality. And that commonality should be something that is on this unique side of the spectrum, right? Like I'm not going to try and, when I was going into consulting, I wasn't reaching out to people and saying, hey, I'm interested in consulting and you work in consulting. It seems like we have that in common. Like that's way too broad. There's like, there's 20,000 plus people at BCG. It's like if the only point of commonality is an interest in consulting, then there's 19,999 other people that you can speak to about that. Like, why is it that you want to speak with like me? And when people reach out to me, if something isn't tailored to me, there's no way that I'm going to, at this point especially, it was different when I was very early on in my career and I had like the bandwidth to be able to do it. At this point, I definitely don't have the bandwidth to be able to kind of keep up with people that are kind of reaching out about everything. I'm not even going to consider responding to a message if I feel like that message could be equally answered by a whole bunch of other people. And I think that the more senior you get, the more that's going to be the case. And so I think that for me, I build relationships with people who are fundamentally very passionate about mentorship and education, who fundamentally believe that like everybody, has innate capabilities. And if just given the right guidance, they can kind of unlock their full potential. I tend to look for people that are willing to invest in other people. I tend to support people that demonstrate that when you give them advice, they're going to actually follow through on that advice. And they're going to update you to let you know, hey, you told me to do ABC. I've done ABC. This was great. I've gotten to a next step. Now what? Okay, this is DEF. And then that's the type of person that I look to stay in touch with and build a relationship with. But it's on the reason that we're building that relationship is because there's fundamentally some very deep intrinsic values that person and myself align on. And then I tend to stay in, when I find those people, then you remember those and you stay in touch with them because you remember them and so forth. So that has been at least how I've thought about it. I'll pause here, Davion. And if you have anything to add to this one, otherwise we can kind of pivot over to the question that's in the chat.
I just have a quick kind of, I think what Tristan's describing is very, very accurate and relevant for kind of this more, I would say, developed version of your network, right? Especially kind of as you progress, right? There's definitely a lot of things where you're just kind of like, well, that person I spoke to 5 years ago, although I wanted that to be a relationship, that they just quite don't fit into this picture right now, right? And I think it's okay, as much as it's okay to invite people into your circle, it's also equally okay to recognize that there probably isn't that natural connection that Tristan is talking about that's really going to propel that relationship forward. At the same token, I don't take for granted this idea of starting from scratch, right? And being like, well, I really do want to get a champion in my corner and I don't really know how to do that. And so I think a mentor of mine, a guy named Nkrumah Pierre, he had a really cool way of kind of, and I think Tristan actually alluded to it, of kind of like artificially making touch points that seem relevant, which was kind of starting like almost Google alerts on some of the more senior people at his firm, right? Or it's because then when an accomplishment or accolade comes up for them that you're alerted by, there's kind of a natural progression to, hey, I saw this, we spoke a few months ago, really excited to think about how this role, how you take on this next role. And by the way, here's an article that kind of I think would be helpful, whatever the case may be, right? But if you don't have those natural deep connection points because you're starting from scratch, I think it's important to try to triangulate ways to, again, still make that connection that Tristan's talking about, but it may not come naturally from your own mind. So I would think about that angle as well. And then the last thing is obviously the more shots you take at the basket of trying to increase your network, the more you'll find that what Tristan is saying becomes true, right? And you'll find that out of the 50 shots that you took in one day, 3 of those people 10 years later are the ones that you would consider to be kind of core tenants in how you make decisions.
Great, thank you so much.
Awesome. No, thank you for the questions. And we'll dive into this next question it's from Manura. She's on public transit at the moment, so unable to unmute. But I was wondering, So the question, Davion, what questions do you ask yourself to create more clarity in problem solving or personal growth and move forward?
It seems like two parts, right? One part of it is when I actually get a task, I think I'm thinking about like an actual, like, this is what you're supposed to do. How do I create more clarity in problem solving? Well, the first thing that I do is sometimes the problem actually itself to me and some of the tasks that I get handed isn't actually as transparent as it may seem. And so for me, when I'm reading things, I think it's just important to kind of like take out, again, the key parts in every situation to make sure you understand the question. Once you understand what the problem is, the way I go about problem solving is firstly, what information do I currently know that I don't have to dig for at my disposal, right, about this particular issue? Right, so that's the first question is, what do I have at my disposal to answer these questions, right? If there's nothing that comes to mind and this concept or this problem is just so abstract, my next question is, well, what terms don't I understand? And can I Google, does the wider internet have anything for me to kind of add more context here? And then I would say my last thought in terms of questions that I need to be asked is, well, when does this problem need to be solved, right? Because then I can backtrack a timeline as to kind of how much urgency, I need to put into that at that present moment in time. The second thing I ask is, well, has this been done before, or has a similar problem been asked at this organization or in this department, right? And then I would get my hands on those resources to figure out where the similarities and overlap are. And then the last question is obviously going to be kind of like, who are the people who I can reach out to, which again, where this network comes into play. Is it my manager? Is that the right person? Maybe it's not my manager. Maybe the right person is actually, Stacia, who is working at KKR, who shares a similar position that I do. She's a year older than me. She probably knows this answer, right? So that's the last question I think I would ask in terms of how to problem solve. And then in terms of personal growth, I think we just have to be honest. It's amazing how the conversations that we have with ourselves really exist and manifest themselves in the desires and the conversations that we have externally that we express to people. And so I would say in terms of personal growth, it's really come to kind of making a real statement as to what I am good at, what I need to be good at that I'm not currently good at, and then, the attributes that I think are kind of a really good, bonus to where I'm triangulating my career. Right. And so from there, what I do in terms of asking myself questions is, do I feel like I have a natural ability to do this? Do I not? Do I feel as though if I get good at this particular thing, it will actually make a difference, right? Because what you don't want to do is try to target skills at your firm that you think are important, but in reality, the people who are promoting you don't really care about it. And so those are the two questions that I think I ask in terms of personal progression and growth within, the corporate landscape.
And maybe I'll just add one thing on that to the point around personal clarity. But one of the things I do is when I wake up in the morning, the first thing that I do is journal, and specifically I make sure that I do that before I check my phone or before I look at my email, because I think that messages are thoughts that are being put into your head as opposed to the thoughts that are already in your own head, which is going to be the best indicator of personal clarity. And in terms of the question that I ask myself, the one of the big questions that I ask myself each day as I'm journaling is, what is it that I need to do today that if I do this thing, I will feel good about how today went? And then when I do go to my computer screen, that's when I start to get a little bit more tactical about saying, okay, at what point in the day, like if it's something that's going to take time, I'll block 2 hours and I'll physically put it on my schedule to make sure that I do that thing. And then I will also, I'll make sure that I take the first step in that direction. And if there's a way to force myself into being accountable, right? The way that you can force yourself into being accountable is like, let's say there's, I'll take the example April 15th is coming up, so I'll take the example of taxes. It's usually a headache for a lot of people. They don't necessarily want to do it. It can be a complicated process to putting it together. Maybe this is more true, actually, as I'm saying it out loud, more true for people in the US. In Singapore, it's a very straightforward process. You just click a button and pay your taxes. You know, if the goal is like, okay, I need to pay my taxes today, then, you know, one thing that might be a way to actually trigger making sure that you're actually doing it. If there's somebody who helps you do your taxes, if you're like paying for those kind of services, you could send a message to that person saying, hey, could you let me know what documents I'll need to do? So basically just taking the first step, or if you're working on an assignment at work, actually, maybe this is a better example. If you're working on an assignment at work and you know that this is like something that your manager expects you to do, but maybe hasn't given a deadline to it, if you were to tell your manager, hey, you know, just as a heads up, this is my plan for today, and at the end of the day, I'm going to provide you an update in terms of where we are on X, Y, and Z project. Now you've kind of like committed to giving that person an update. You're going to actually make sure that you do this thing. So I guess I will wake up, I'll listen to myself in the form of a personal journal. I'll ask myself, what do I need to do in order to make sure that today I feel like is successful? And then the first thing that I do still before I check messages or anything like that is I send the very first message that makes me take a first step in the right direction of accomplishing that thing. And then I do something to make sure that I'm accountable to other people by telling somebody about it and so forth. So that tends to be, for me, something I do to kind of stay accountable and maintain that personal clarity.